She arrived on the afternoon ferry, the last passenger to step off the gangplank, moving neither quickly nor slowly, but with the particular deliberateness of a person who has learned that haste rarely changes the arithmetic of a situation. The Puget Sound was the color of pewter that October, the mountains behind the town holding their snow like a secret they were not yet ready to tell. She carried a single canvas bag, salt stiffened from 3 days at sea, and in her coat pocket, wrapped in a square of oilcloth, she carried a folding ruler. It had belonged to her father, a carpenter of modest reputation and immoderate precision, and it was the only thing she had kept when the creditors came through his workshop after the fever took him in March, measuring and itemizing every last chisel and draw knife as though grief were a process that required documentation. She had watched them do it without a word. She had become very good at watching without a word. That quality, it turned out, was about to be badly misunderstood. His name was Colum Bryce, and he had written to the Seattle matchmaking agency in January, with the flatness of a man placing a timber order. He needed someone capable of managing a house. He ran a boat-building yard on the northern edge of the Sound and kept long hours, and required a domestic arrangement that would not produce complication. The agency's correspondent, a practical woman named Mrs. Flood, who had developed an impeccable eye for subtext, read the letter twice, set it down, and then picked up her pen and wrote to a woman currently employed as a draftsman's assistant at a shipyard in San Francisco, who had just been informed with genuine apology but firm finality that the yard was consolidating its offices and could not justify keeping 2 people who did the work of 4, when one of them had the misfortune of being a woman in an era disinclined to justify its injustices. Flood wrote 6 sentences. The woman in San Francisco read them, looked at the folding ruler on her work table, and wrote back in 4. Her name was Nora Finn. She had married at 23, a draftsman named Theodore Finn, who was gifted with his hands and careless with money in roughly equal measure, and who left behind, when the influenza took him in the winter of 1898, a wife of 25, no children, and $412 in debt to a suppliers association in Oakland that had a lawyer and no sympathy. She had spent 3 years earning that debt down to nothing, working first as a seamstress, which she despised, and then as an uncredited assistant to a naval architect named Hargrove, who had looked at her sketch corrections with initial affront and subsequent silence. Hargrove had retired in June. His replacement had his own assistant, male, and considerably less interested in Nora's geometry. Hence San Francisco. Hence the ferry. Hence the pewter sound and the salted bag, and the folding ruler wrapped in oilcloth, and the town of Briar's Landing, spreading itself up a hillside in the gray October light, as though it had not quite decided how large it intended to be. Colum Bryce was waiting at the end of the dock. She had been told he was a broad man, and the description was accurate in the sense that it told you the shape, but not the weight of him, which was the kind of weight that comes not from size, but from absolute stillness. He stood with his hands at his sides and his hat level, and his eyes finding her across the dock with neither urgency nor welcome, merely recognition. He was 35. He had been a widower for 3 years. He looked, she thought, like a man who had gotten very comfortable with the idea that certain things were simply gone, and had organized his life accordingly. He said, "Miss Finn." she said, "Mr. Bryce." He picked up her bag before she could, not with gallantry, but with efficiency, and turned toward the town. She followed. They covered half a block before he spoke again. "Pollard has been coming 3 days a week, but she's got her own family and can't manage more. I have a man, Deacon, who handles the yard, and 2 builders who take their meals at the yard. My daughter Lily is in school until 3. She doesn't speak much." Nora said, "I understand." He said, "I can offer $8 a month, the room at the back of the house with the east window, and whatever you need from the merchant account. It's a working arrangement. I want to be plain about that," she said. "So do I." He glanced sideways at her. It was a brief and assessing look, the kind you give a piece of timber you are considering for a structural member, and she returned it with the same candor. He nodded fractionally, as though something had been confirmed rather than begun, and they walked the rest of the way to the house in the silence of 2 people who have already understood each other and are simply waiting to see. The house was a 2-story frame building on a corner lot, well built and badly kept. The yard had gone to tangle. 3 of the porch boards wanted replacing. Inside, the kitchen was serviceable, but the pantry was organized on no discernible principle, and the sitting room had the particular dishevelment of a space that is regularly cleaned and never quite inhabited. She stood in the center of it for a moment, turning slowly, taking the measure of a place, the way her father had taught her, not what it was, but what it could bear. Callum set her bag at the foot of the stairs and said, "Supper is usually at 6. There's bread from yesterday, and the rest is your domain." He left for the yard. She stood alone in the kitchen for 10 minutes. Then she put on the apron hanging behind the door and began. Lily came home at 3:15. A serious child with her father's stillness and her mother's dark eyes, who stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at Nora with the directness of a person who has learned that adults frequently do not last, and therefore sees no reason to make premature investments. Nora looked back at her with the same equanimity. She said, "I'm Nora. Do you know how to set a table?" Lily said, "Yes." Nora said, "Good. Set it for 3, please." Nora had been uncertain, as a newcomer learning a household's rhythm, whether she would eat with Callum, or after him, or separately in the kitchen, which would have been the custom in half the houses she had ever worked in. Callum came in at 6, washed at the pump, and walked straight to the table and sat in his chair and unfolded his napkin, and then looked up at the 2 plates she had set and said, "Where's yours?" She said she had thought to eat after. He said, without heat, "There's no call for that. Sit down." It was not an invitation to warmth. It was a correction of an error, but it landed on something in her chest, like a hand steadying a level, and she sat, and they ate supper in the kind of quiet that is not absence, but presence, and Lily ate her soup and did not speak, and did not seem to need to, and outside the wind came off the water, and the house, for the first time in some years, held 3 people at once. She found the shipyard's ledger books, 3 weeks into her time at Briar's Landing, in a crate behind the desk in the room Callum used as an office and plainly visited, as infrequently. She had gone in to locate the household merchant account records, which he had told her to use freely, but had not told her where to find, and she had located them within minutes, because they were neatly kept, and then she had found the yard's accounts, which were not. She sat down, because standing did not seem adequate for what she was reading. Callum Bryce's boat-building yard was a good operation. She could see that in the orders, in the quality of the bills of materials, in the reputation that surfaced between the lines of customer correspondence. It had 12 contracted builds in the past 2 years, 4 of them commercial vessels, and the craftsmanship commanded premium prices. It was also, she calculated by the second hour of reading, 180 days from ruin. The mechanism was this: a man named Aldous Pratt, representing a creditors collective called the Harborside Investment Syndicate, had acquired Theodore Bryce's original loan notes from the bank that held the yard's founding debt, and he was calling them under a clause that permitted acceleration of the full principal if any 2 consecutive quarterly interest payments were made more than 15 days late. He had been making them 17 and 22 days late, consecutively, because his receivables were slow and his buyers paid in arrears, and he did not understand, because no one had ever shown him, that lateness was the mechanism and not the consequence. Pratt had been sitting on his rights for 8 months, allowing the condition to ripen. The acceleration notice, if he filed it, would require full repayment of $940 within 90 days, which was a sum Callum Bryce did not have and could not raise in that time from the yard's current work alone. She sat with this for a long time. The lamp burned down 1/4 of an inch. From the upper floor she could hear Lily's quiet movements, the creak of her bed, and then stillness. Outside, the sound moved in the dark. She was something adjacent to afraid, but structurally different, the state that comes when a problem comes fully into focus, and you can see both its edges and its possible treatments. She had spent 6 years reading plans that other people had drawn, and finding the stresses they had not accounted for. This was a plan that had been drawn to fail, and she could see exactly where. She did not tell Callum that night. She spent 4 more evenings with the books, working at the kitchen table after supper when Lily was in bed and Callum was in the yard, finishing work by lantern light, which he did on 3 nights of the week as a habit she had come to know the sound of. She mapped every receivable, every outstanding invoice, every pending build. She wrote 12 letters, sitting straight backed at the table in the small hours, in a hand that was spare and exact, to customers who had balances outstanding, to a material supplier in Tacoma who owed the yard a credit, who had once written a letter of inquiry about Bryce's yard that had never been answered because Callum did not like correspondence. She answered it now, at length, with precise specifications and a proposal for a pilot vessel contract. She also wrote 1 letter to a lawyer in Seattle named Hartwell, who had been recommended to her by Mrs. Flood in a postscript as a man who was good at reading the fine print of things that were designed not to be read. She did all of this without telling Callum, not because she was hiding it from him, but because she was not yet certain she could deliver what she intended, and she did not see the utility of raising a man's alarm before you had something to offer him alongside it. Her father had taught her that too. Never show a client the flaw until you have the repair in your hand. The weeks that followed had a particular quality she would remember for the rest of her life. The quality of a thing being built in parallel with itself. Externally, the house was becoming a different place. She had repaired the porch boards with Lily's solemn assistance and a borrowed saw. The pantry was organized by category and frequency of use. Supper was reliable and various. There were flowers from the yard's overgrown side bed and a jar on the table. Once Lily identified which ones were flowers and which were weeds, which turned out to be a more philosophical question than expected. Callum came home to these changes with the expression of a man who notices a ship sailing better and does not yet fully believe the repairs have held. Internally, the other building was happening at the kitchen table. She and Callum had fallen into the habit of sitting there after supper, he with whatever mechanical problem the day had produced, she with her letters and figures. They did not always speak. When they did, it was about the yard, or the household, or Lily. But gradually, as November drew down, and the lamp held its small circle of light against the early dark, the silence between them changed its character. It became less the silence of two separate people occupying the same room, and more the silence of a thing that did not need to be said because it was already in some form that preceded language, simply understood. He said to her one evening, watching her work without appearing to watch, "You came from a shipyard yourself." She said, "A drafting office." "Naval architecture." She said, "How do I look at it?" He was quiet for a moment. "Like you're reading it," he said. She looked up at him. He was looking at his hands. She said, "I suppose I am." He nodded and did not say anything else, and she went back to her letter, and outside the sound moved in the dark, as it always did, indifferent and patient, and the lamp held. Aldous Pratt arrived in the third week of November on a Tuesday, which was Callum's longest day at the yard. She was not surprised. She had been expecting him since a letter arrived the previous week from Lawyer Hartwell, confirming that the acceleration clause was valid, but that a challenge was possible, and outlining what facts she would need in the room when Pratt came to press his advantage. She had the facts in the room. She had arranged them the previous evening with the methodical care her father had used when setting out tools for a difficult joint. Nothing extra. Pratt was a soft man in a good coat, which told her everything about where his work was done. He had the particular ease of a person who is accustomed to walking into situations that have already been arranged in his favor. He introduced himself to her as Callum's housekeeper and used the word "sweetheart" when asking if Mr. Bryce was available. She said, "Mr. Bryce is at the yard. I'm Nora Finn." He looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating a situation downward. He said, "I'm sure Mr. Bryce would want to be present for a conversation of this nature." She said he would, and he will be at 5. You're welcome to wait, or we can begin. The figures are the same either way. He chose to begin, which she had expected, because men like Pratt prefer audiences they can perform for over ones who might answer back. She set the receivable summary on the table between them. She said, "The yard has $296 in outstanding receivables that are currently collectible." She placed the supplier credit letter beside it. She said, "There is additionally a credit note from the Tacoma Timber Company for $61, confirmed in writing last week." She placed the Victoria letter. She said, "A letter of intent for a pilot vessel contract from a firm in Victoria arrived on Saturday. The advance payment, per their standard terms, is $200 on signing. That brings collectible assets to $557 within 60 days. Pratt looked at the papers. His ease had not left him entirely, but it had shifted. The way weight shifts in a hull when conditions change. She said, "The outstanding principal on Mr. Bryce's original loan notes is $940. The acceleration clause in the transferred notes requires full repayment in 90 days of the filing, with $557 available at 60 days, and the yard's current work billing approximately $90 per month. The balance would be retired in full within the 90-day window." She set down the final document. She said, "This is a letter from Mr. R. Hartwell's office in Seattle, advising that the transfer of the loan notes from the original bank to your syndicate did not include the required notification to the debtor, as specified by the terms of the original instrument, which makes the transferred acceleration rights currently unenforceable. Mr. Hartwell suggests the syndicate may wish to review its documentation before filing." The room was very quiet. Pratt said, "There will be other instruments." She said, "There may be. If you find them, please communicate through Mr. Hartwell. He has all of the yard's records." She said it pleasantly, as a fact among facts, and she held his gaze with the steadiness of a person who has spent 6 years finding other people's errors and is not impressed by the attempt to bluster past them. Pratt gathered his papers, 2 of which were not his, and then set them back down. He left at 10 minutes past 3. She put the kettle on. Callum came in at 5, and she told him. She did it concisely, without drama, at the kitchen table, with the relevant papers organized in front of her and Lily upstairs, doing her schoolwork. She told him about the notes, the acceleration clause, the receivables, the credit, the Victoria contract, the lawyer. She told him the syndicate's claim was likely to fail, and the yard's position was manageable. She told him all the relevant numbers, and let them stand without commentary. He listened without moving. He was very still, in the way that still water is still, not absence. When she finished, he looked at the papers for a long time. Then he said, "When did you find this?" She said, 3 weeks ago. He said, "And you didn't say." She said, "Not until I had something useful to say alongside it." He looked at her then, and it was not the appraising look he had given her on the dock, not the structural assessment. It was something slower and more complete. The look of a man who has been moving through a landscape for years and has just, in the changing light of an ordinary afternoon, seen what the landscape actually is. He said, "Nora." He said, "I'm not a quick man." She said, "I know. You're a thorough one." He looked at the table. He nodded once. He said, "Thank you." She said, "You're welcome." But the room held the conversation the way good timber holds a joint, not with show, but with the simple integrity of things fitted together correctly, and neither of them found a reason to move for some time. The Victoria contract was signed in December. The Tacoma credit was collected in the same week. The receivables came in faster than she had projected, partly because her letters had been direct about timelines in a way that Callum's invoices had historically not been, and the yard's customers, it turned out, were not unwilling to pay promptly when they understood that promptness was expected. By the last day of January, the loan notes were cleared. Hartwell sent a letter. She read it at the kitchen table, and then walked to the yard and handed it to Callum without a word, and he read it, and folded it, and put it in his coat pocket, and went back to the hull he was planing. And she went back to the house, And at supper, Lily asked why the two of them were quieter, and Lily accepted this as information and ate her supper. Spring came to Briar's Landing, slowly, as spring does on the Sound, the light returning before the warmth, the water going from pewter to silver to a tentative blue. The yard took on 2 more builders. Nora formalized her arrangement with the accounts, a fact Callum documented in a letter to Hartwell with the same flatness he used for timber orders. Lily had begun talking more, not volubly, but consistently, the way a door begins to open when the hinge has been properly oiled. And she had taken to sitting beside Nora at the kitchen table in the evenings with her schoolwork. And Callum would come in and see this and would go to the wash basin and not say anything, but the set of his shoulders was different than it had been in October. He was a thorough man. She had said it, and it was true, and it applied to everything he did, including the process of knowing his own mind. She was patient with this, not because she was without feeling, but because she had come to understand that in him, thoroughness was not delay, but a form of respect. He was not a man who would say a thing he had not fully verified. She found this quality, once she had named it accurately, to be one of the things she valued most about him, which told her something she had been quietly aware of since November. On a Saturday morning, in late April, the water silver and the alders coming into leaf, he found her on the porch, with her coffee and her folding ruler, which she had gotten into the habit of carrying on her morning rounds of the property, marking what wanted repair. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at her in the early light. She was measuring the gap in the porch railing that had been on her list since December, and had been there when she arrived, and would be there until she saw to it. He said, "Nora." She closed the ruler and looked at him. He came out onto the porch. He stood beside her, looking at the water, and she waited, because she had learned how he arrived at things, and she knew he was arriving at something. He was quiet for a long time. The ferry was a white shape on the far side of the Sound, moving north. He said, "I know I came to this late. I'm not built for speed." "I think you know that by now," she said. He said, "I've been thinking about whether the yard arrangement accounts for everything, whether there's a different arrangement that would be more accurate." She said, "What kind of arrangement?" He looked at the water. He said, "The permanent kind. If you'd want that, with me and Lily and the yard and whatever comes after it." He stopped. He said, "I'm not saying it well." She looked at the profile of him, the line of him against the silver water and the pale morning, this thorough and steadfast man who had taken 6 months to arrive at 4 sentences and had not wasted a word of them. "That's the main thing." He turned and looked at her. She said, "Though I will note for the record that I have been standing on this porch since October, and it is now the end of April." The corner of his mouth moved. He said, "I told you I wasn't quick." She said, "You told me." And here we are. He held out his hand. It was a carpenter's hand, broad and scarred, and she put hers into it, and that was the whole of the proposal, and it was exactly enough. They married in June, in the yard, which Deacon and the builders had cleaned and hung with lanterns, and Lily stood beside Nora in a dress she had helped to sew, serious and upright, and pleased in the particular way. Nora wore blue because she had the fabric, and it suited the water. She carried nothing, because the day itself was enough to carry. The ceremony was read by the town's notary, a small and efficient man named Greer, who had done 200 of these and showed a becoming respect for the ones that felt like completions rather than beginnings. The vows were the standard ones, but when Callum said the words, he said them with the same quality he brought to all his measurements, as though he was sure of the dimension before he spoke it. And that was, she thought, the truest promise she had ever been given. Afterward there was a meal in the yard, and the builders drank too much whiskey, and Deacon gave a toast. That was mostly a complaint that it had taken Callum so long that Deacon had begun to think the yard would carry him to his grave, a lonely man. And Lily fell asleep in a chair with her head on Nora's arm at 9 o'clock, and Callum carried her upstairs and came back down and stood in the doorway of the lantern-lit yard and looked at his wife, and she looked back at him, and neither of them needed to say what that moment was. 5 years later, the Bryce yard had 12 men and a reputation that had reached as far as San Francisco. The house on the corner lot had a proper garden and a repaired porch and a room added to the back for the 2 younger children, a boy of 3 and an infant girl. And in the evenings the older children's noise could be heard from the yard the way the sound itself could be heard. Always there, familiar as breathing. Lily was 12 and teaching herself navigation from a book Nora had ordered from Seattle, and she had her father's steadiness and her mother's unrelenting eye for structural error, and everyone who met her knew she would be formidable. Aldous Pratt's Harborside Investment Syndicate had ceased operations in 1901, a fact Nora had read in a shipping circular with the mild satisfaction of a person who has made a correct calculation and watched it resolve at its natural pace. She had mentioned it to Callum over supper, and he had said, and passed the bread. And that was the end of Aldous Pratt. The folding ruler lived on the kitchen windowsill. Lily had asked about it once, where it came from, and Nora had told her about her grandfather, the precise carpenter, and the creditors in the workshop, and the ferry across the Puget Sound, and the man standing at the end of the dock, who looked like a person who had decided certain things were simply gone, and had not yet revised that opinion. Lily had listened in her thorough way, and then asked, "And then what did you do?" And Nora had said, "I sat down at the table and started reading what was there." And Lily had thought about this and said, "And then you fixed it." And Nora had said, "And then we fixed it. There's a difference." That was the thing, she thought, on October afternoons when the water went back to pewter and the mountains held their snow, and the yard sounds came through the kitchen window like the sound of something well and truly made. Not the rescue and the rescued, not the quick and the slow. 2 people at a table in lamplight, each reading what the other could not, making the same thing with different tools, which is the only way anything lasting ever gets built. She had come here, displaced, and had become necessary, and in becoming necessary had become, without planning it, known. Not seen in the way of being looked at, seen in the way of being understood. She had waited 36 years for that particular thing, and it had been worth the crossing,